The question is if medieval people feared Vikings after the Viking Age. This needs thinking about what the Viking Age really was and when it ended. And what fear means in this context. Was it a present danger or just a long memory? The answer is not a simple yes or no. The direct widespread fear definitely changed. But the idea of the Viking lingered. It became part of history, legend, and even later political struggles. The Viking Age, a period of Norse expansion, is usually put from the late 8th century to the mid 11th century. It started with sudden raids. Lindisfarne in 793 AD is often given as the first big one. It ended around the time of the Norman Conquest of England in 1066. This year is important. Harald Hardrada, the king of Norway, tried to conquer England. He was defeated at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. This marked the last major Viking invasion of England. Soon after, William the Conqueror, a descendant of Vikings himself, took the English throne. His Norman army was not a Viking army in the old sense. They were feudal lords, deeply integrated into European Christian society. So, when we talk about after the Viking Age, we mean from the late 11th century onwards. This means the 12th century, the 13th century, and later. This was a time of big changes in Europe. Kingdoms grew stronger, feudal systems became more organized, Christianity spread even further. Scandinavia itself changed. The Norse peoples, who had been the Vikings, formed their own kingdoms. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden became recognized Christian states. They started acting more like other European powers. They had their own internal politics, they fought wars with each other and with neighbors. They built churches and towns. Their rulers focused on consolidating power at home. The nature of the threat from the north changed profoundly. The image of the longship arriving unannounced, full of pagan warriors, eager to plunder monasteries and take slaves, faded. It was replaced by a more familiar European threat. This was the threat of one Christian king fighting another, or of local lords clashing over land. The unified, large-scale, pagan-driven raids stopped. The target areas, like England and France, had also changed. They were no longer easy pickings. They had developed better defenses, they had stronger armies and navies, they had fortified towns and castles. Medieval people lived in a world where war and violence were common, but the source of that violence shifted. For a common person living in, say, 12th century England, the immediate fear was less about a Viking raid. It was more about a local lord's quarrel, or the king's army passing through, or banditry. The very idea of who the Vikings were became historical. They were no longer a living, present threat. They were becoming figures of the past. Their actions were recorded in chronicles. They were told in stories. This distinction between a present danger and a historical memory is crucial. The Christianization of Scandinavia was a massive factor. Once the kings and their people adopted Christianity, their cultural and political outlook changed. Raiding Christian lands, especially churches, became less acceptable. It went against their new faith. This did not stop all violence, of course, but it redirected it. Scandinavian rulers now sought legitimacy from the Pope. They participated in crusades. They traded with other Christian nations. They became part of the European family of nations. This meant the motivation for the old style of raiding was gone. Their warriors were no longer heathens looking for easy wealth. They were Christian soldiers or traders. They were no longer the terrifying Northmen of old. They were Danes, Norwegians, or Swedes. They were like any other people. So when the Viking Age truly ended, the direct military threat largely vanished. The reasons were complex. They involved political consolidation, religious conversion, and defensive improvements across Europe. This doesn't mean all violence stopped, but it means the specific fear of the Viking as a foreign pagan invader faded into the background. It was replaced by more contemporary worries. By the end of the 11th century, the landscape of Europe was very different from when the first longships appeared. The reasons for the decline of large-scale Viking activity are clear. They show why the direct threat almost disappeared. First, unified Scandinavian kingdoms emerged. Before, the Norse lands were often fragmented. They had many petty chieftains. These chieftains could raise war bands and raid independently. But over time, powerful kings rose in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. These kings started consolidating their power. They built administrative structures, they established laws, they collected taxes. Their focus shifted from external raiding to internal control. They wanted to create stable realms. This meant their energies were spent on building their own nations. They also started fighting each other for dominance in Scandinavia. These were conventional wars between recognized kingdoms. They were not the opportunistic raids of earlier Vikings. For example, Knut the Great had established a vast North Sea empire in the early 11th century. It included England, Denmark, and Norway. But this empire was personal. It did not last long after his death. His successors struggled to maintain control. England eventually went back to English rule, then to Norman rule. This shows that even powerful Viking-descended rulers became part of the larger European political game. Their goals were state building and dynastic succession. They were not just raiding. Second, the Christianization of Scandinavia was hugely important. Missionaries had been active for centuries. By the 11th and 12th centuries, Christianity was firmly established. The kings became Christian. The population followed. This changed the mindset of the Norse people. Raiding Christian lands, especially churches and monasteries, became morally problematic. For centuries, these places had been prime targets. They were rich and undefended. But as fellow Christians, the Scandinavians now had shared religious values. This didn't make them saints. But it removed a key motivation and target for the old raids. Their aggression, when it happened, was redirected. It was used in crusades against pagans in the Baltic, or it was used in wars against other Christian kingdoms. This was the same as any other European power. Third, the targeted areas in Western Europe became much stronger defensively. England, for example, had suffered terribly during the Viking Age, but it learned hard lessons. More kings, like Alfred the Great and his successors, built burghs, which were fortified towns. They developed a more effective standing army and a navy. The Norman Conquest further strengthened England's military and administrative capabilities. Castles became common. They were formidable defensive structures. They could resist attacks far better than the old, often unfortified settlements. France also developed stronger feudal armies. Coastal defenses improved. This meant that a raiding party could no longer land almost unopposed. They would face organized resistance. The risk-reward calculation for raiding changed. It became far more dangerous and less profitable. Fourth, economic factors played a role. The Norse people developed extensive trade networks. They traded furs, timber, fish, and other goods. Raiding was no longer the primary means of acquiring wealth. Trade offered a more stable and sustainable way to prosper. As towns grew in Scandinavia, they became centers of commerce. This encouraged peaceful interaction with other European nations. It created an incentive for stability, not disruption. So by the 12th century, the specific kind of fear that defined the Viking Age was largely gone. No longer did people dread the arrival of pagan longships. The kings of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were powerful. But they were now part of the European system. They posed threats like any other king. Their armies fought other armies. Their fleets were part of larger naval strategies. Well, they were not the terrifying, unpredictable Northmen of old. The fear had not vanished completely, of course. The violence was a fact of medieval life, but the source and nature of that fear had shifted profoundly. Even though the direct Viking threat had largely disappeared by the 12th century, the memory of their depredations lived on. This memory created a different kind of fear. It was not a fear of immediate attack. It was more like a collective trauma. It was a historical bogeyman. This lingering shadow lasted for centuries. How was this memory preserved? Mainly through written records and oral traditions. Monastic chroniclers were often the first to record Viking raids. They described the destruction of monasteries, the killing of monks, and the desecration of holy sites. These accounts were vivid and often exaggerated. They emphasized the Vikings' pagan brutality. They portrayed them as instruments of God's wrath or as agents of the devil. These chronicles were copied and circulated. They helped shape a long-lasting image of the Viking as a savage, destructive force. For example, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in England detailed many Danish invasions. It recounted the suffering, the sieges, and the widespread destruction. Later, English historians and writers would read these accounts. They would retell these stories. They ensured that the memory of Viking terror did not die out. Even in Scandinavia, sagas were written down later in the Middle Ages. These sagas told stories of heroic deeds, but also of fierce battles and conquests. They kept the idea of the powerful, warlike Norsemen alive. This historical memory was sometimes used for propaganda purposes. Their rulers, especially in England, would sometimes remind their people of past Danish invasions. This could be to unite them against a new enemy, or to justify their own power by claiming they protected the realm from such chaos. For instance, when England faced threats from other European powers, the Viking past could be invoked. It was a reminder of external dangers and the need for strong leadership. It created a sense of national identity based on overcoming these past invaders. The idea of the Northmen became almost a stereotype. It represented barbarism and paganism. This was a convenient contrast to the civilized Christian nations of Europe. It helped define European identity by what it was not. Even if actual Danes or Norwegians were now Christian and civilized, the historical image remained. It was a cultural construct, it was a way to talk about the past, it was a way to understand evil or chaos. Think about how cultures remember devastating wars. Even generations later, the stories of suffering and heroism are told. They shape how people see their history. The memory of the Vikings was like this. It was part of the collective consciousness. It was a cautionary tale. It was a way to explain why certain fortifications existed, or why certain monasteries were rebuilt. The ruins of old churches might serve as a physical reminder. They hinted at a time of great upheaval and fear. So, while a medieval peasant in the 13th century might not have feared a Viking raid today, they certainly knew about them. They knew the stories, they heard the legends, monks wrote about them, poets sang about them. This created a cultural memory of fear. It was a historical fear, not an immediate one. It was a deep-seated understanding of a past terror that had shaped their world. It was a shadow that lingered over the historical narrative of Europe for many centuries after the last longship had sailed home for good. The Vikings had become historical figures. They were no longer contemporary monsters, but their ghost haunted the imagination of medieval Europe. As the High and Late Middle Ages progressed, the fear of Vikings transformed. It moved from a widespread terror to a more localized and nuanced concern. The term Viking itself started to change meaning. It blurred with concepts like pirate or raider from any northern land. The idea of the Viking as a distinct, organized, pagan foreign invader largely vanished. However, piracy and coastal raiding remained a constant problem throughout the Middle Ages. This was especially true in areas close to maritime trade routes. It was also true in regions with complex political loyalties like the Scottish Isles. Sometimes these pirates might have been from Scandinavia, but they were not operating as part of a Viking movement. They were simply opportunistic criminals. They were motivated by profit, not by pagan expansion or conquest. Consider the Scottish Isles. The Norse influence here was strong for centuries. The Earls of Orkney, for example, had strong ties to Norway. They often acted as independent rulers. They sometimes clashed with the Scottish crown. These conflicts could involve raids and violence, but these were not Viking raids in the 9th century sense. They were feudal conflicts. They were struggles over land and loyalty. They involved people who were culturally mixed, often both Norse and Scottish. Any fear felt by locals in these areas was more about the immediate power struggles. It was about specific lords or factions. It was not about a general Viking threat to Christendom. In the Baltic Sea, the Hanseatic League rose to prominence in the 13th and 14th centuries. It was a powerful network of trading cities. This region saw constant competition and warfare between various powers. These included German states, Polish-Lithuanian kingdoms, and the Scandinavian kingdoms. Piracy was rampant. Groups like the Vitalienbrüder were active. They were a brotherhood of privateers and pirates. They sometimes had support from various lords or cities. Some of these pirates might have been of Scandinavian origin. But they were not acting as Vikings. They were part of a broader medieval phenomenon of maritime banditry. The fear they generated was a fear of any pirate, regardless of their ethnic background. Even within Scandinavia, civil wars and internal disputes were common. These conflicts sometimes involved raiding and pillaging. Danish kings might raid Swedish lands, or Norwegian nobles might fight their neighbors. Such actions created localized fear and instability. But again, these were not Viking attacks. They were conventional medieval warfare. They happened between Christian rulers and their subjects. The fear was directed at a specific political enemy, not a shadowy Viking force. The identity of the Viking became less about ethnicity and more about behavior. If someone raided your coast, stole your goods, or attacked your village, they might be called a Viking in a general sense. But this was more like calling any bandit a thief or robber. It did not imply the return of the ancient Norse threat. It was simply a descriptive term for a specific kind of aggressive action. The people carrying out these actions were typically identified by their nationality. They were Danes, Swedes, or Norwegians. They were not simply Vikings. So any fear of Vikings in the later Middle Ages was a far cry from the existential dread of the early Viking Age. It was fragmented, it was localized, it was often indistinguishable from the general threat of piracy, banditry, or feudal warfare. Medieval people had many enemies. They had many reasons to fear. They had to worry about powerful neighbors, rebellious lords, and the ever-present danger of the Black Death. The idea of the monolithic, pagan Viking threat had dissolved into the complex tapestry of medieval life. The memory remained, but the active fear had largely evolved into something else entirely. When we look back at whether medieval people feared Vikings after the Viking Age, the answer is complex. It requires separating immediate military threats from lingering cultural memories. The direct, widespread existential fear of Viking invasion definitely ended with the Viking Age itself. That period closed around the mid-11th century. The political, religious, and military landscapes of Europe changed too much for the old style of raiding to continue. The reasons for this shift are clear. Scandinavian peoples converted to Christianity. They formed unified kingdoms. These kingdoms then became players in mainstream European politics. Their focus shifted from external raiding to internal consolidation and conventional warfare. At the same time, the targets of earlier raids, like England and France Champ, developed stronger defenses. They had fortified towns, castles, and more organized armies and navies. This made large-scale raids much less profitable and far more dangerous. The economic incentives for raiding also diminished. Trade became a more stable source of wealth for the Norse. However, the memory of Viking depredations persisted for centuries. This memory was powerful. It influenced chronicles, sagas, and oral traditions. Monks wrote vivid accounts of Viking brutality. These stories kept the image of the savage, pagan Northman alive in the European imagination. This was not an active fear of imminent invasion. Instead, it was a historical shadow. It was a cultural memory of past trauma. It was like how a country might remember a devastating war from generations ago. The stories are passed down, they shape identity, but they don't mean people live in constant fear of the same war happening tomorrow. Localized raiding and piracy did continue throughout the Middle Ages, but these were largely disconnected from the original Viking phenomenon. These were generic acts of violence. They were common features of medieval life. They happened in coastal areas and on trade routes, irrespective of the raider's origin. If Scandinavians were involved, they were acting as pirates or soldiers in dynastic struggles. They were not part of a coherent Viking force. The term Viking itself probably became a generalized label for any northern raider or pirate. It lost its specific ethnic and ideological connotations. Furthermore, medieval people faced many new and more immediate threats. These made the historical Vikings seem less urgent. They had to contend with feudal warfare between powerful lords. They faced economic crises and famine. The Black Death devastated Europe in the 14th century. New external enemies emerged, like the Mongols and later the Ottoman Turks. These were very real, present dangers. They overshadowed any lingering specter of the Vikings. So, in conclusion, the fear of the Viking as a contemporary terror faded into history. By the 12th century, a medieval person living in Western Europe was far more likely to fear their own king, a neighboring lord, or a band of common brigands. The Viking became a historical or legendary figure. They were part of the past, not the present. Their stories served as cautionary tales. They informed cultural identity. But they no longer represented a clear and present military danger. The widespread fear that characterized the early Viking Age was replaced by new realities and new threats that shaped the lives of medieval people.